The first drops fell like needles, cold enough to sting, hard enough to drown out any hope of pretending the world was just. By the time they dragged Mercy Wren to the yard, the storm was already waking. Thunder rolled behind the foothills like some old god clearing its throat. The townsfolk stood in a rough circle, boots sinking into the churned mud, eyes cast downward when hers met theirs. Nobody spoke. Nobody stopped it. Mercy's thin dress clung to her bones the moment the downpour took hold. Her wrists were tied with coarse hemp rope to the hitching post outside the sheriff's clapboard office. The sign above her head read liar. Sheriff Hoyt spat tobacco juice in the dirt and turned his back to her. He called it justice. Said she'd lied about a stolen calf, covered for her brother's gambling debt with a false claim. The real story was no one cared to hear it. Not from a girl whose mother had died birthing her in the same shack her father drank himself to death in. She was 19 and looked less than that. Big eyes, sun-bit hair, calloused hands she'd learned to hide at her skirts. In Hollow Ridge, that counted for little. The preacher's wife watched her through the dry glass of the general store window. The blacksmith's boy watched too, but ducked behind his pa when Mercy's eyes caught him staring. So she stood, let the rain trace lines down her cheeks, mixing salt with the sky's sorrow. By dusk, the road had turned to sludge. Mercy's feet were bare in the mire. The rope around her wrists carved angry ridges into her skin. Her knees trembled, but she refused to sink. If she sank, she'd drown in her own shame. That was the lesson here. Let them see her drip, shiver, break apart like wet parchment. Let it be known that in Hollow Ridge, a poor girl's word meant nothing. Somewhere down the street, a saloon door slammed. A piano I cupid a surnote. Laughter rose up from behind whiskey glasses. Easy laughter, easy forgetfulness. Mercy let her head drop back. The rain hit her lips. She imagined it was a baptism that would wash her clean, but the rope said otherwise. It was near dark when he appeared. He came up the road on a mule too old for real miles, saddle creaking under his weight. Name was Amos Cutter. Folks called him a widower and a drunk, half true, half earned. He'd been gone near 5 years, holed up in the mountain passes with nothing but a Winchester and bad memories for company. When his boots hit the mud, people took a half step back. Not fear, just that unease folks get when they see a man who's buried too many things alone. He didn't speak, just stood at the edge of the circle, rain dripping from the brim of his battered hat, eyes locked on the girl bound to the post. Mercy lifted her chin, met him square. She didn't know him, but something in the stubborn tilt of her mouth reminded Amos of the wife they'd buried too young, the daughter who'd come out blue and never cried once. Sheriff Hoyt saw him then. Spat again, louder this time. Ain't your trouble, Amos, he drawled, voice all cracked leather. Keep moving. Amos didn't. His eyes flicked to the sign. Liar, nailed right above her crown like a brand. The rope at her wrists. The rain drumming harder now, as if it too was sick of what passed for justice here. He thought of speaking, but words had never been his craft. So he just stood there, a big man gone soft at the edges, hands that had once built barns now shaking in his pockets. He watched her knees buckle again, shoulders pitch forward. The wind carried her quiet prayer, or maybe it was just the storm, but it landed in his bones. And something in him moved. The mule shifted behind him, snorted steam into the cold. The townsfolk held their breath, waiting for him to leave. He didn't. The first nail Amos Cutter did not remember stepping forward. He only remembered the sound, the creak of the ropes straining as Mercy's weight leaned into it, the wet slap of his boots sinking deeper than the rest. The hush that fell over the crowd felt like snow, thick enough to muffle the last of the jeers. He stopped a foot from her. Up close, Mercy looked like something the flood had tried to wash away and failed. Her hair clung to her brow in dark tangles. Her lips were cracked where she'd bitten down to keep from crying out when the rope burned fresh into her wrists. Miss, he said, voice low, rough as a gravel road. He hadn't called a woman miss in near a decade. She lifted her eyes, lashes stuck with rain. No fear there, just the dull flame of someone who knows begging is wasted breath. I ain't your trouble, sir, she managed, her words catching like a twig at her throat. She meant it to free him, or herself, but Amos felt it burrow under his ribs all the same. Reckon that's for me to decide. Behind him, Sheriff Hoyt's boots squelched closer. The crowd parted to let the law pass, though everyone kept their eyes low. Hoyt stopped at Amos's shoulder. The iron badge on his chest caught what little light the storm allowed. "Leave it, Amos," Hoyt said, his breath sour with chew. "This here's town business." She lied. Lies fester. Best she stand and think on it. Amos's fingers twitched at his side. The memory of his wife's grave marker in the rain. The old wooden cabin he'd left to rot up in Juniper Hollow because he couldn't bear to mend the roof she'd cooked beneath. "She's paid enough?" Amos said. The words cost him something. He felt it go, a coin dropped in a wishing well. Hoyt laughed. "A sound too mean for the softness of the rain. World don't work like that, Cutter. You know it. She stands till dawn. Then she can crawl home and mind her tongue next time." Mercy's knees hit the post behind her. She bit back a gasp that nearly undid Amos. He looked at the sign again. Liar, slapped up like a brand on an unbroken horse. A memory flickered. When he'd first come west with Hannah, they'd burned the brand off a stolen Mustang so no rancher could claim it. Fire and freedom. He stepped past Hoyt. Close enough now that the sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster, but stayed there, half threat, half bluff. Amos hooked his fingers under the sign's edge. The nail fought him. Splinters bit under his thumb. He tugged once, twice. The third time the nail gave, squealing like a hog in the slaughter pen. The wood fell to the mud at Mercy's feet. Someone in the crowd gasped. Just one sound, but enough. The blacksmith's boy peered around his father again, eyes wide. The preacher's wife turned away, pressing a gloved hand to her mouth. Hoyt barked, "Pick that up. Nail it back." But Amos was already untying the rope. The fibers left angry welts that wept under his rough grip. Mercy hissed, but held still. Where hands fell free, they hung useless at her sides. "You building yourself a gallows?" Hoyt snarled. "Ain't no law says you can." Amos turned. For a moment, the old soldier's coldness returned to his eyes. "Ain't no law says I can't." He left the sign where it lay, stomped it deeper into the muck with the heel of his boot, took Mercy's elbow, gentle, like he was lifting a half-broken foal, and walked her through the circle of townsfolk who would not meet her eyes. In the hush, a small voice cracked the silence. A child, girl, or boy, nobody saw which. A whisper. She didn't lie. The sheriff whipped around, searching for the mouth that dared say it. But it was too late. The words stuck like burrs in the wet hem of Mercy's dress. By the time they reached the edge of town, Amos's coat draped over her shoulders. The storm had turned warm. The sign behind them sank into the mud, a word half swallowed by earth. Shelter for a broken thing, they crossed the last fence post before the town gave way to open scrub and dogwood. The rain softened once the buildings fell behind them, as if the storm had only wanted to punish Hollow Ridge and its sins. Mercy stumbled once, twice. Amos caught her each time by the elbow, his palm warm and calloused. He guided her toward his mule, a sway-backed, gray named Hollow, because Amos had a mean sense of humor about things left empty. Hollow stamped a hoof in the soaked dirt, snorted steam. Amos spoke low to him, same way he might calm a skittish colt. Mercy watched him, lips parted to ask a question. She swallowed instead. "Up," Amos said, voice gruff. He cupped his hands like a stirrup, but she just stared at the mule's bony flank. Rain dripped from her hair onto her raw wrists. In the low light, the rope burns looked angry and bright. "I can walk," she croaked. The lie weighed nothing next to the weight she'd carried all day. "Ain't his skin," Amos said. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She hissed at the fire in her wrists but bit it back so hard her teeth clicked. Once she was settled sideways, skirts bunched against the mule's withers. He took the lead and started them up the muddy trail that wound into the foothills. They did not speak for a long while. Their breath and the mule's were the only warmth in the black, wet world. Trees rose like ghosts on either side, shedding drops that hissed in the brush. Somewhere an owl asked its question and got no answer. Mercy's eyes fluttered, the cold and exhaustion pulling at her bones. Amos heard her breath change, hitch, then smooth out. He had not looked back. By the time they reached his claim, a half-standing cabin tucked against a bluff of red stone, the rain had stopped pretending to be a punishment and turned into a hush. Hollow's hooves struck stone as they crossed the last stretch. Amos felt the old boards of the porch give under his boots. He laid a hand on the doorframe, testing the memory of it. It was just 4 walls and a sloped roof that leaked in 3 places. A cold hearth, a cot, and a table made from a saloon door someone had tossed. Once this place had smelled of cornbread and pipe smoke and clean pine soap, Hannah's soap. Now it smelled like loneliness that had settled in like dust. He lifted Mercy down. Her eyes cracked open, clouded, but sharp enough to catch the place. She didn't say thank you, didn't say anything. Just looked at the sagging roof, the split door, the hearth cold as bone. Ain't much, Amos said, voice hoarse with apology he didn't know how to word. Better in the post. She almost smiled at that. Not the lips, but her eyes softened just for heartbeat. Inside, he sat her at the table. She sank like a stone dropped in a deep creek, sudden and silent. He found a scrap of linen, dipped it in the rain barrel outside. Her eyes followed him, but did not flinch when he touched her wrists. The cold cloth drew a hiss through her teeth. She did not pull away. He dabbed the burns, gentle as an old horse brushing against a hand. Up close he saw the bruises blooming under the thin skin of her forearms. A map of every time she'd leaned too heavy against the rope to keep her knees from hitting mud. "You got kin?" he asked finally. It came out like a cough. She shook her head. "Ain't nobody left wants a liar for a sister." He pressed the cloth to her palm, let her hold it herself. Something shifted in him then, not big, not loud. Just a hinge squeaking open where rust had ruled too long. "I'll build you something better," he said. He didn't know what he meant yet. Cabin, shelter, something that didn't leak or creak or give her rope burns when she spoke her piece. Mercy did not laugh at that promise. She just nodded, her chin trembling once before it steadied. Outside, the last of the rain ticked against the roof, searching for cracks to slide through. Nails and old wood morning came without warmth. Just a thin sun behind the bluff and the hush of damp ground steaming. Amos was up before it. He didn't sleep much these days, hadn't for years, truth be told. He sat on the splintered porch rail, pipe cold in his teeth, thumb tracing the grain of an old cedar beam he'd saved from a barn long rotted. Inside, Mercy slept curled on the cot. He'd draped an old quilt over her, the last scrap of Hannah's needlework. He'd found her boots drying by the hearth where she'd slipped them off in the dark, too tired to hide the holes worn through the soles. He watched the trail down to town, smoke rising off Hollow Ridge in mean little snakes. The bakery, the blacksmith's forge, the preacher's chimney. Somewhere down there, Sheriff Hoyt would be spitting and cursing and wondering how to nail the sign back up over Mercy's head. But he wouldn't come up here. Not yet. The townfolk liked their cruelty to stay tidy. On Main Street, where it could be gossiped over coffee and pie. Amos pushed off the rail. He needed wood. Nails. More than that. He needed the old ghost of himself that used to build barns and mend chicken coops and hold a baby cradle steady while Hannah lined it with soft cloth. He found the axe leaning where he'd left it, blade eaten with rust, but still true enough. He took it to the pines at the edge of the clearing. With each swing the world got smaller. Just the creak of his shoulders, the thunk of iron into green flesh, the resin scent bleeding out like the past was trying to breathe again. He hauled the first beams to the cabin's shoulder by noon. Mercy woke to the sound of hammering. She found him kneeling in the mud, driving nails into fresh-cut planks. She watched him through the broken window, the way he measured twice and cursed softly when the plank slipped from his grip. She did not ask what he was doing, just slipped her raw hands into the basin, washed her face, found the broom behind the door, and swept the corners of the one room that hadn't been touched since Hannah's laughter filled it. By the second day, the gossip found its way up the trail. The preacher came first, on a horse too fine for the muddy track. He dismounted with care, boots clean as church pews. Amos heard him before he saw him. The preacher's voice soft but sharp. "Brother Cutter, you ought not do this. She'll bring shame to your name. Folk are saying you took her in for reasons not pure." Amos paused mid-swing, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. Mercy stood just inside the door, shadow on shadow, broom still in her grip. "You preachin' shame to me, Brother Caro?" Amos asked. His voice held no malice, but no softness either. Caro cleared his throat, eyes flicking toward Mercy's shape. "You're making folks wonder if she's earned a place up here. If maybe she lied more than just about a calf." Amos leaned the hammer against the post. He stepped close enough for Caro to smell the sweat and sawdust and the cold steel under his words. "Brother, when you've buried a wife in frozen dirt, you can come talk to me about what's pure." Caro flinched like a skittish mare. He swallowed, tipped his hat, and left with the same careful grace he'd arrived with. When the hoofbeats faded, Amos turned back to the frame rising beside the old cabin. A new wall, stout and true, rough beams pinned tight. Mercy stepped out onto the porch, hair tied back from her eyes, rope burns still angry, but less raw. "What you buildin', Amos?" she asked, voice small but steady. He looked at her, then at the half wall. He could see it now, a cabin that wrapped around her like an apology he'd never learned how to speak. "A place they can't tear down," he said. She nodded, looked at the fresh-cut pine, the iron nails driven deep. She reached out, laid her palm flat on the wood. For the first time in too long, she felt something solid that was hers to touch. Above them, crows wheeled lazy circles. The town below kept whispering, but the hammer drowned them out, one nail at a time. The rain comes again. The rain found them on the third day. Not the cold, punishing storm that had pinned Mercy to the post, but a slow, soaking drizzle that crept into bones and made hinges groan. Amos woke to the patter on the half-built roof, the new walls catching it like a drum. He listened to the beat a moment before swinging his feet to the floorboards, boots thudding soft as regret. Mercy was already up. He found her in the lean-to he'd nailed against the old cabin wall. A crude shelter, but dry enough if you tucked close to the beams. She'd gathered kindling and laid it careful as coins in a church plate. Her hands shook when she struck the flint, but the flame caught anyway. Sparks danced in her hair when she leaned too close, but she didn't flinch. Fire never scared her. Men did. He watched her work from the doorway, shoulders pressed to the frame like it was all that kept him upright. She felt his eyes, but didn't turn. There was something soft in that, something he wanted to bottle before it slipped away. By mid-morning the trail turned to soup. Hollow the mule nosed the mud near the fence, ears flicking at shadows in the rain. Mercy stood at the corner of the half-built wall, a wool shawl Amos had dug from an old chest wrapped tight around her shoulders. She watched the trail like she expected ghosts. What came instead was Sheriff Hoyt. He rode up slow, horse's hooves sucking at the road. Behind him trailed two men Amos didn't recognize, new deputies maybe, or just farm boys playing hardlaw. Hoyt didn't bother to dismount. He lifted his chin at Amos, who stood hammer in hand like a man ready to build or break, depending how the next words fell. "Amos Cutter," Hoyt called, voice flat under the drip of rain from his hat brim. "We got talk that girl's hiding up here." Amos said nothing, just wiped the handle of the hammer with his thumb. The rain tapped the tin can nailed over the door, steady as a heartbeat. Hoyt flicked his eyes to Mercy. She stepped closer to the beam, but did not flinch. The rope burns on her wrists were bare, no sleeves to hide them now. "She's free to leave," Amos said. Simple as saying the sun rose in the east. Hoyt spat over the side of his saddle. The rain washed it down before it hit the ground. "She's property of the town till her lies are righted." Mercy's voice cut the wet air like a blade. "Ain't no lie to right." Her words startled her as much as the deputies. Her chin trembled once, but she bit it steady. Hoyt's grin was a wolf's grin. All teeth, no warmth. "Girl, you hush. Else I'll drag you back down there myself. Tie you again, but this time we'll carve the truth in your hide." The threat hung there. Rain dripped from Hoyt's coat to the muddy earth. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle, uneasy. Maybe he saw the rope burns. Maybe he remembered a sister or a mother once accused of something small that became something big. Amos stepped down from the beam, closed the space between him and Hoyt's horse so the animal's hot breath misted his chest. He lifted the hammer like a man ready to knock sense into rotten wood, or a rotten skull if need be. "She stays," Amos said. Each word came out like a nail struck true. "You want her back?" Bring the whole damn town. Bring your rope. I'll bury it here where it belongs." For a moment, nobody spoke. The rain filled the silence. One of the deputies turned his eyes to the tree line, studying how the pines caught the mist. Hoyt leaned forward in the saddle. His voice dropped, low and sour. "You think you're building something strong here, Cutter, but it'll rot like all the rest. Rot and cave in." Amos did not blink. "Maybe, but not today." Hoyt jerked the reins. The horse wheeled around, splashing mud over Amos's boots. The deputies hesitated, glancing once at Mercy before they followed. When they were gone, Mercy stepped out from under the shelter. She looked at Amos, the hammer in his hand, the line of his shoulders under the flannel gone dark with rain. "They'll come back," she said. He met her eyes, rain dripping from his brow like a fresh baptism. "So let him." Inside the half-built frame, the hearth crackled. The rain tapped the roof like a patient drum. The rope lay buried in the mud, but its memory wrapped around Mercy's wrists like a ghost she was learning not to fear. Beam by beam, they worked the next stretch in stubborn silence. The two of them. Amos with his big hands and bent spine, Mercy with her raw wrists wrapped in torn cloth so the hammer handle wouldn't bite too deep. It was Mercy's idea to pick up the hammer herself. She hadn't asked. She just took it when he paused to sharpen the hatchet and set her eyes on the crooked beam above the window frame. The first swing near rattled the nail out of her grip, but she found her rhythm quick enough. She drove it home, thunk, 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 like she meant to bury every lie they'd stapled to her name along with it. Amos watched from a shade of the old cabin's doorway. He didn't offer to help, didn't offer to stop her either. Some lessons a man shouldn't steal from someone clawing back a piece of themselves. By dusk, the new wall rose stout beside the old one. The fresh pine beams smelled sweet in the dusk, a promise of shelter thick enough to hold back whatever storms might come next. They set the roof joists in place under the last of the orange sky. Amos nailed one end. Mercy braced the other, her palms steady, feet braced in the churned earth that used to be just a patch of weed-choked yard. Inside, the hearth glowed again, real fire this time, not just the small, hungry flame she'd struck with flint. Amos had scavenged what he could: a battered iron pot, a dented tin mug, salt pork that tasted more salt than meat, but filled the air with something like home. They ate on the floor by the fresh-framed wall, backs to the boards. Mercy sat cross-legged, Amos with his knees pulled up, shoulders hunched so his big frame didn't blot out the fire. She watched him as he chewed, methodical, eyes half on the flames, half on the rain spitting against the new planks. "You ever build a whole house round a person before?" she asked, half grin hiding in the shadows under her lashes. He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "No," she laughed, soft, more breath and sound, but the warmth of it made the half-cabin feel bigger than it was. "Seems foolish." He shrugged. "Better than letting the rain have you." She set her tin aside, dug her nails into the splintered floorboard, like she could anchor herself there for good. "They'll come," she said again. She'd said it before, but tonight the words were less fear and more fact. "Hoyt won't quit. Folk need someone to hate." Amos tipped the mug to his lips. Water cold and clean. "Let him come." She studied him then, the hollowed cheeks, the beard that didn't hide the grief lining his eyes. The man who'd built a coffin for his wife with the same hands that now built a roof for a stranger who'd only ever known the cold side of the law. "I don't reckon I'm worth all this," she whispered, so quiet he almost missed it under the fire's crackle. Amos set the mug down, metal clinking soft against the hearthstone. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix the break in her voice. He just looked her dead on. "Don't matter what you reckon," he said. "Reckon it's my say." She didn't answer, just pulled her knees tighter to her chest, the hem of the blanket brushing the rope scars she hadn't hidden tonight. Outside, the last of the rain let up. The pine boards drank the drip-drip like thirsty dogs. From the tree line, a lone crow watched the flicker in the cabin window. If it carried a message, it kept it for the dawn. A crack in a mob the dawn brought no sun, just a bruised sky, low and swollen, as if the rain might come back to check what had been built in its absence. Mercy woke to the sound of a hammer again, steady and sure. Amos at the roof beams before the birds even started their fussing. She lay a while, blanket tucked to her chin, listening to the thunk of nails biting fresh pine. A good sound, a stubborn sound. By mid-morning she was out there too, shoulders stiff but hands steady as she stacked the last firewood Amos had split by lantern light the night before. Every time she stooped, the rope burns tugged under the bandages, a reminder that even freed wrists can remember knots that cut deep. She caught the smell before she heard the boots. Sweet pipe, smoke drifting up the trail. The hush that falls when folks gather for something mean, the way barn animals go quiet when they sense the butcher's blade in the yard. Amos felt it too. He paused mid-swing, hammer resting on his thigh. He turned just enough to catch Mercy's eyes. She didn't flinch this time, just dropped the last split log by the door, wiped her palms down her skirt. The first man over the rise was Hoyt, of course, hat pushed low against the spit of cold wind. Behind him, maybe a dozen others, men, mostly a handful of women in clean aprons and tight mouths. The blacksmith was there too, but his boy was missing. Mercy noticed that small mercy like a secret in her chest. Hoyt planted himself at the fence Amos had lashed together from scrap. He made no show of touching the latch. The mob behind him pooled like rainwater against a rut in the road, waiting for a push to spill. "Cutter," Hoyt called, voice syrup slow but mean. "Heard you built her a fine cradle up here." Mercy stood half behind the doorframe, visible enough so they'd know she wasn't cowering inside. She hooked her fingers through a loose nail in the half-finished siding, a small thing to hold her up if her knees forgot how to. Amos leaned the hammer against the post. He stepped to the fence, broad chest blocking the doorway behind him. "Ain't no cradle, Hoyt. Just four walls and a roof so the wind don't have its way." Hoyt's grin was a thin line. "Town says she owes her dues. Standing in rain ain't penance enough for a liar." She didn't lie. A voice cut through the wet hush. Not Mercy's, an old man's, cracked and tremored by age but sharp as a rusted blade. All heads turned. From the back of the knot stepped old Caleb McBride, bones draped in a patched black coat, cane carved from cottonwood. He'd seen the town born, married half its folk, buried the rest. Hoyt's sneer faltered just enough to show his teeth weren't as sharp as he liked folks to think. Caleb shuffled closer, breath wheezing in the chill. He jabbed his cane at the mob behind Hoyt. "She didn't lie about that calf. I saw the Brander's boy running it through Miller's Orchard Day before it went missing. Been keeping my tongue, 'cause I figured you'd see sense without an old man speaking where he ought not." Hoyt's jaw twitched. "Don't reckon your eyes see true anymore, Caleb." Caleb laughed, a dry, splintery sound. "My eyes saw your pa drunk in the street more times than they seen the church steps, and nobody calls me blind for saying that." A ripple through the gathered folk, small but real. A wife at the back lowered her eyes, cheeks pink with shame that didn't belong to her, but to the town that fed on easy blame. One of Hoyt's deputies shifted his boots in the mud. Mercy stepped fully into the open then, hair loose around her shoulders, rope burns bare. She lifted her chin, voice rough but aim true. "You nail your signs on me all you want. Ain't changing the truth. Ain't changing who stole what." She reached for the fence rail, leaned on it, a gesture too small to be defiance except for how steady her hand was now. Hoyt's grin curdled. His eyes darted from Mercy to Amos, then back to the old man whose cane still trembled at his chest. The mob behind him held their breath, waiting. "You think this changes anything?" Hoyt spat. "This changes nothing. Town's got rules." Caleb rapped his cane against the rail, once, twice, an old man's gavel. "Ain't the town's rules that built this land, boy. It's the folk standing up when a lie turns to a noose." Silence then. Just the wind rattling the pines, the soft creak of the half-built cabin settling around Mercy like armor. Hoyt stepped back first, boots sucking at the mud like the earth wanted him gone. The rest drifted after him, some slow, some faster, none meeting Mercy's eyes. When the trail cleared, Mercy sank to her knees in the cold mud beside the fence rail. Amos crouched beside her, said nothing, just laid his palm over her shoulder, warm and heavy as an oath. Inside, the hearth fire waited, a small thing against the big night, but enough. The burning rope, they waited until the last orange thread of dusk slipped behind the bluff. The cabin felt different that night. The air thicker, the shadows softer, the new walls catching the crackle of the hearth and holding it close. Mercy sat by the door with her knees drawn up, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The rope lay in her lap, the same coarse hemp that had bit her wrists raw 3 nights back. Amos had found it buried in the mud behind the fence where Hoyt's boots had turned it up. She'd asked him not to toss it. Not yet. Not until the time was right. Amos watched her from the low table. He'd shaved the rough edge of a beam with his hunting knife, carving down splinters that might catch her skin. Each scrape of the blade sounded like sandpaper on old bone. "You sure?" he asked, voice calm, but the firelight made his eyes burn soft and gold. Mercy nodded. Her fingers brushed the frayed knot that still held the loop where it had once bit the post behind the sheriff's office. She could still feel the rain pounding her shoulders, the crowd's eyes like stones pressed to her skin. She stood slow, careful not to lose her nerve to the tremble in her knees. Crossed the room to the hearth, rope dangling loose in her grip like a dead snake. Amos rose too, but did not touch her. He knew better now. This was her ghost to bury. She knelt by the flames. For a moment she held the rope near her face, let the fibers tickle her lips, tasted the salt that still lingered where rain and sweat had soaked it. She pictured the sign, "Liar," nailed above her head like she was livestock to be auctioned off. She fed the end of the rope into the fire. The flame caught fast, chewing through hemp with a hiss and pop. The smell rose sharp and bitter, burnt hair, old fear turning to smoke. She fed in more, inch by inch, until the knot itself glowed red, then fell apart in the coals. She did not flinch at the sparks that jumped at her sleeve. Didn't blink when the last length turned to black wire ash. When it was done, she rocked back on her heels, wiped her palm on her skirt. The ghost was gone. Not the memory, but the piece of it she could hold in her hand. Outside, the wind caught the smoke and pulled it up through the crooked chimney pipe. The new roof held. No drip, no draft, no leak to send the warmth fleeing into the black pines. Amos lowered himself to the floor beside her. He stretched his legs out long, boots crossed at the ankles. For a time they just sat, the two of them, shoulder to shoulder, watching the last coil of smoke twist up the flue. Mercy spoke first. "I reckon the rope's gone," she murmured. Amos nodded. "That it is." She turned her face to him. In the flicker of firelight her eyes were clean, washed clear like the sky after thunder. "Then so's the girl who wore it." He met her gaze, that new name on her tongue, soft but hard as a nail driven true. She wasn't begging him for a title, wasn't asking permission to stand up taller than she had before. It settled something in him, a knot behind his ribs that had sat tight since Hannah's breath left him all those years ago. He reached for a length of raw pine, a plank they'd saved for the last wall, set it across his knees, handed her the knife. She understood without asking. Together, they carved her name, Mercy Wren, into the wood, deep enough to last through rain and wind, and every whispered lie the world could toss her way. When it was done, she pressed her palm flat over the carved letters, felt the splinters bite back, a promise that her story was hers to keep now. Outside, the wind rattled the branches, but inside, the fire hummed low, warm enough to hold a roof overhead and 4 walls tight to the ground. A shelter stitched together beam by beam, nail by nail, and the ghost of a rope turned to nothing but smoke on the night air. A small defiance the days that followed settled like dust after a cattle drive, slow, silent, but restless underneath. Amos kept swinging his hammer, roof shingles this time, fitting them tight so the rain would never find Mercy's shoulders again. Mercy kept her hands busy too, patching what old scraps of cloth they had in the curtains, mending Amos's shirts where the cuffs had frayed from too much work and too little rest. Word drifted up the trail in whispers. Hoyt wasn't done. The sign might have burned to ash, the rope turned to smoke, but the town's hunger for an easy blame stayed coiled and patient like a rattler under a porch step. One dawn, Mercy found a dead crow nailed to the fence rail, belly slit, wings spread wide like a warning. Amos buried it under the pines without a word. When he came back inside, his boots left mud on the new floor. Mercy swept it clean, her face unreadable. By the week's end, they knew Hoyt's next move was close. The mule, hollow, brayed at shadows near the clearing edge, ears flicking at rustles no wind could make. Amos took to sleeping light, rifle propped within reach by the hearth. Mercy left the door unbarred, not out of foolishness, but because if trouble came, she wanted to see it clear and straight. It came one dusk, just as the first stars fought through the clouds. Mercy stood by the woodpile, apron dusted with bark chips. Amos was inside, sharpening the old hatchet against a whetstone. He heard it first, the hush of too many feet on pine needles, careful, slow, a lie trying to wear the shape of quiet. Mercy didn't run. She pressed her palm flat to the cabin wall, the one with her name carved deep where the rope once bound her. She stood like that until Amos stepped out, hatchet hanging loose at his side, boots sinking in the soft dirt. From the tree-lean, Hoyt's voice rose, too calm, too easy. "Evening, Cutter. Girl." Mercy's chin lifted. Amos stepped closer, so his shadow brushed hers in the dusk. Hoyt pushed through the pines. No badge tonight, just a pistol at his hip and 3 men behind him. The same deputies from before. One young, one old, one with a scar that cut his lip in 2 directions when he smiled. "Town says you owe him," Hoyt said. His boots crunched over the line of rocks Amos had laid to mark where the yard began. "She owes him." Amos didn't answer. He shifted the hatchet's handle in his palm, thumb tracing the old blade's nicked edge. Hoyt's eyes flicked to Mercy, narrowed. "What's to keep us from talking her back now, huh? Rope or no rope? Liar's still a liar." Before Amos could speak, a small sound cut the dusk, a high whine, a soft growl. From the shadows near the stack of fresh-cut beams came a mutt, ribs showing under patchy fur, one ear torn near clean through. Nobody had fed it, nobody had called it, but there it was, tail low but teeth bare to Hoyt's boot. Mercy stepped forward, quiet but sure, until she stood between Hoyt's reach and the mutt's shaking growl. She knelt and laid her hand on the animal's back, thin, trembling, but alive with a defiance that made Hoyt's boot shift back 1/2 inch. "Ain't Takin what ain't yours," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "Ain't standin' tied to no post again." Hoyt's grin cracked wider, but the pistol at his hip stayed where it was. His men shifted behind him, waiting for him to pull or speak or spit the order. The mutt pressed closer to Mercy's knee. Its growl deepened, small teeth bared against men too used to the world flinching when they raised a hand. Hoyt's eyes slid to Amos, the hatchet, the steady breath, the big man who'd buried a rope in rain-soaked dirt and hammered a girl's name into fresh pine as if it were gospel. "Last chance, Cutter," Hoyt sneered. "Ain't no cabin strong enough. Then tear it down." Amos cut in, voice low as thunder rolling over dry land. "But you'll bury me first." Silence again. The wind rustled the pines. The mutt's growl filled the cracks where Mercy's heartbeat might have echoed too loud. Hoyt's grin faltered, just for a heartbeat, as the truth settled in. They'd come for an easy scrap, but found teeth instead, found nails driven too deep to pull free. Hoyt spit in the dirt. The deputies watched Mercy's hand steady on the mutt's back, watched Amos's hatchet glint in the half-light. One turned his eyes to the black sky. "Ain't worth it," he murmured. Hoyt spun on his heel. Boots scraped. The others drifted after, a knot of threat unpicked by a growl, a girl's hand, a man who decided some things didn't break easy. Mercy stayed crouched, palm pressed to the mutt's ribs. When the last footstep faded, she whispered soft in the animal's torn ear, "Good boy." It shivered but stayed pressed to her knee, warm and breathing. Amos lowered the hatchet. He stood behind her in the dark yard, a roof over her head, a wall at her back, a shelter nothing soft could tear down tonight. The quiet survival spring came early that year. The last snow melted off the bluff in wet sighs, feeding the creek that curled like a vein past Amos's cabin. Mercy rose each dawn before the light cracked the pine boughs, bare feet in the cold grass, hands plunged deep into the wet dirt where she'd staked her first rows of turnips and beans. The cabin stood finished now. 4 stout walls, a tight roof, shutters Amos carved himself from planks rough but honest. Mercy's name was still there on the inside beam, the knife marks dulled by her thumb tracing them when the wind howled too close. Some nights, she caught Amos watching her do it, the corner of his mouth hitching up like he wanted to tell her something but couldn't find the words. The mutt stayed too. Nobody claimed it, so it claimed her instead, sleeping by the hearth, nose pressed to the stone floor, tail wagging when Mercy hummed low as she stirred a battered tin pot over the coals. She named him Rope, half a joke, half a promise. He wore no collar. She liked him free. Some days, Amos joined her in the garden, big hands better fit for hammer and axe, but gentle enough to mound soil around tiny green shoots. He never talked much about Hollow Ridge. Didn't need to. The town still spat her name when the whiskey ran low and the fire in their stoves burned too weak to warm their mean hearts. But they never came up the trail again. Hoyt stayed sheriff, but folks whispered that the badge fit him worse every month. Old Caleb McBride died come June, quiet as candle smoke, his name carried in Mercy's prayers when she pressed her fingers to the tilled earth. She marked a stone for him by the garden's edge, just a chipped bit of limestone with truth scratched shallow where weeds couldn't smother it. She kept the rope burns visible, never hid them under sleeves or bandage once the skin closed over. When she knelt to weed the rows or lift rope in her lap when thunder cracked, the scars shone pale against the dirt, proof that no sign nailed above her head could hold her there forever. Some nights, long after the hammering was done and the wind died soft against the beams, Amos would sit beside the hearth. Pipe cold, hatchet laid aside. He'd watch Mercy mend a split seam in his shirt or feed the coals to keep the cabin warm. Sometimes he'd tell her how Hannah used to hum the same tune Mercy did without knowing it. A half-forgotten hymn turned lullaby, turned back again to something that stitched silence into something safe. One night, Mercy lifted her eyes from the coals, soft glow turning her hair to copper. "You reckon it'll hold?" she asked. "This roof, this ground." Amos took a long breath. Let the pipe sit empty between his teeth. "Ain't never built nothing that didn't leak. Given enough time," he said, voice gravel soft. "But some leaks you patch, some you let in, so you remember what's worth keeping dry." Mercy smiled then, a slow, earned thing. She pressed her palm flat to the floorboards, felt the warmth seep up from the stones below. Rope stirred, lifted his head, settled it on her boot like he'd always belonged there. Outside, the garden slept under moonlight. Tiny shoots trembled in the breeze, but held their ground, stubborn green against the hush of the pines. The cabin held too, boards tight, nails deep, ghosts buried under the hearthstone where rain and rope and rumor couldn't reach. And if someone asked what it all meant, the girl who once stood barefoot in the rain, wrists raw with shame, might say, "It means you don't stand tied when you can build your own walls. It means you bury the rope, but keep the scar. So the next wind that comes to break you finds no place to nail its sign." Inside the warm hush, Amos Cutter closed his eyes and let the crackle of the coals be enough prayer for the both of them. A battered man and a girl who would never stand outside in the rain again. Not alone, not forgotten, not silent. Just Mercy, just standing. The campfire echo, some say, if you ride the North Trail past Hollow Ridge when the spring rains come soft and mean, you can see a cabin perched stubborn on the bluff. Fresh pine turned silver by wind and time, a garden cut neat into the slope like a promise you whisper instead of shout. Some swear they see a girl kneeling there at dawn, palms pressed into dirt that never forgets what the sky once did to her. They say she hums a tune only the pines can carry, low and steady like a prayer stitched into the bones of the land. And if the wind's right, you might hear the hush of old nails driven true, the creak of a roof that leaks just enough to remind a man what's worth mending. You might hear a mutt's bark, rough but alive, and a hammer setting its rhythm to the heartbeat of folk who decided not every noose has the last word. No signs nailed above the door now, just her name carved deep where no storm can pry it loose. No rope but the memory of it, soft as a scar under her sleeve, sharp enough to remind you that a lie only holds so long as folk keep their eyes down. And when your fire burns low and your breath fogs the dawn, you might wonder, what would you build if the world tied you to the rain? Some folks stand tied. Some folks stand free. And some, like Mercy Wren, stand and build, beam by beam, until the rope's just smoke and the story's yours to tell by firelight, so it never sinks back into the mud again. If this story moved you, subscribe now. More raw tales, quiet legends, and campfire truths waiting just for you.